بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وصل على المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات وبارك على محمد وأزواجه وذريته. In the previous lesson, we were studying the departure of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or escaping of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the city of Mecca with his beloved companion and closest companion, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. We studied the circumstances surrounding his escaping from Mecca, and when he was leaving Mecca, turning around and remorsing the situation, or showing remorse at the departure from his beloved hometown where he grew up, where he was born, where he was raised. And one second, who turned the lights off? Okay. Apologies. So I was mentioning that we studied how Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam escaped from Makkah Mukarramah with his closest companion Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu, and how he turned around, looked at the city of Makkah, and he said a few sentences out of his love for Mecca, sadness that he expressed, that if it were not for the people, he would never have left this town. Then we studied that he arrived at a cave, which is known as Cave Thawr. So we're going to continue, inshallah, from this point onwards. And with regards to this particular instance, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam being in the cave with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu, there's a reference to it in the Quran. And that reference is in Surah At-Tawbah. And Allah reveals that verse in a different context. The context of that verse is during the Battle of Tabuk, which occurs many years later, in the 9th year after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam's migration to Medina Munawwara after the Hijrah, 9 years later, when the Battle of Tabuk is taking place, or when the situation arose, Allah Azza wa Jal commanded all of the believers to leave. This was one of the battles where everyone was required to attend, unless they are women, children, old people, and of course those who are disabled and handicapped. So this was the expedition of Tabuk. And Allah Azza wa Jal said, what is it that when you are told to leave, you become difficult, or it becomes difficult for you? إِثَّاقَلْتُمْ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ. Are you pleased with the worldly life, while what Allah has is better, or the worldly life is nothing but very small and meager? So around that time, or around those verses, Allah says, إِلَّا تَنصُرُوهُ فَقَدْ نَصَرَهُ اللَّهُ. If you do not stand up and help the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah has indeed helped him in the past. إِذْ أَخْرَجَهُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا ثَانِيَ اثْنَيْنِ. When he was driven out of his town while he was one of two. One of two meaning he was with the second. Who was the second? Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. إِذْ هُمَا فِي الْغَارِ. When both of them were in the cave. إِذْ يَقُولُ لِصَاحِبِهِ. When he said to his companion, لَا تَحْزَنْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَنَا. Don't be afraid, Allah is with us. So this verse is a reference to this incident that we're studying right now. The verse in Surah At-Tawbah that I recited just now, which is verse number 40 of Surah number 9. It was revealed in a different context. It was revealed at the time of Tabuk, but it's in reference to this particular incident where Allah is establishing clearly that His assistance was with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam during this moment and during this time. And there's also another indication in this verse about the status of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu, because Allah refers to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq as the companion of his. إِذْ يَقُولُ لِصَاحِبِهِ. When he said to his friend and his companion. Therefore, anyone who claims that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu was corrupt, Allah forbid, or that he was zealous over leadership, na'udhu billah, This is a response. The Quran is saying it. He is a Sahabi. He is a companion of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So let's discuss this story now, inshallah. There's a lengthy hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha in Bukhari, which speaks about the hijrah and covers the entire journey or most details of the journey. In that journey or in that particular hadith, Aisha radiallahu anha says that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, my father Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, arrived at the cave of Thawr and they stayed there for 3 nights. They stayed in cave Thawr for 3 nights. Now, Ali al-Tantawi rahimahullah, he says something very beautiful at this point. He says, nobody should think for a moment that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was hiding because he was afraid. Generally, the perception we would have as human beings is that somebody is in hiding because they are afraid of something or because they're cowards. Nobody should assume for even a moment that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a coward or that he is weak at this point. Rather, the way that we should look at this is that he is just like any military commander who has his eyes set on bigger prizes. You have a choice. With little means and you only have one companion with you, you become bold and some would say unintelligent, and you come into the middle and you display yourself in front of the enemy, and then you become captured or worse, killed. Or one is that you have a strategy, and with that strategy you are in hiding for a moment, and then of course you have your eyes set on bigger prizes, bigger victories. The victory of Badr that is forthcoming, Khandaq that is forthcoming, Tabuk that is forthcoming, Khaybar that is forthcoming, Hawazin that is forthcoming, Fatah Makkah, which will happen because Allah promised you will come back to Makkah, we will bring you back to Makkah, you will be victorious over Makkah. And if that doesn't happen, if Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is not hiding, if he's not strategic, if he's bold and he comes out into the open, there's no Qadisiyah, there's no Yarmouk, there's no Gibraltar, there's none of this. None of this happens. And the reason why Allah sent Islam to eradicate evil, to eradicate darkness, to remove ignorance, to establish justice, to raise the flag of justice, and none of that would have happened. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had to take strategic steps. This hiding was not done out of cowardice or weakness or any of that. It was strategy. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was deploying strategy at this moment. Now, when Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu arrives with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at the cave, he displays amazing qualities. It's not just the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life that is endangered. His life is also endangered. Think about this for a moment. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu is not safe. It's not just the Prophet ﷺ whose life is endangered, his life is also endangered. What does he say to Rasulullah ﷺ? He says to him, wait here a moment. Let me go and inspect the cave. Perhaps in the cave there is an enemy hiding. Perhaps in the cave there is a dangerous animal. Perhaps in the cave there is a snake. And he could not bear Rasulullah ﷺ feeling any pain. It's better that I go. If something happens to me, something happens to me, but at least you are still alive. So this is Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu demonstrating immense adab. Adab means etiquette, respect. Somebody who's more noble than you. Somebody who has a higher status than you. And our deen is very big on adab. Islam is huge on adab. Adab is not just a cultural thing. Yes, some cultures are more have more etiquette or more adab than other cultures, for sure. Absolutely. Like the way that we would speak to, or children speak to their parents in Western culture, in Eastern cultures, that would not be tolerated, generally speaking. I don't know if things have changed now in Eastern cultures, but growing up with a father who was from the East and he wasn't born in the West, there were limits, boundaries. You couldn't You couldn't show anger. You couldn't raise your voice. I mean, you wouldn't have the audacity to raise your voice. There was no concept of answering back. There was no like that just didn't exist in our makeup, right? So different adab and different etiquette for different times and different regions and different places. But Islam is very big on adab. Now, what does adab mean? Adab means the appropriate behavior for the appropriate time. So every time has an adab. There's an adab for the library, adab for the masjid, adab for the grocery store. There's an adab everywhere you go. So that's the term in Arabic, adab, which means etiquette, manners. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is demonstrating amazing adab for somebody who's more noble than him, somebody who has a higher status than him. He goes in and inspects the cave, and when he realizes and he recognizes everything is fine, then he allows Rasulullah or tells Rasulullah, now you can enter the cave. But what happens when he comes out of the cave? He realizes that there was one hole that was still left. So he went to do something about that hole. Now there is one incident mentioned that Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, while they were in the cave, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was lying on his lap, with his head on the lap of Abu Bakr Siddiq. So here again, we see adab. Because the cave doesn't have very comfortable spots. The ground is not comfortable. The wall is not comfortable. So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu lends his lap to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam so he can take rest. And it mentions that Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu covered the hole with his foot. And while he was in that position, he was bit by an insect. And he was bit quite severely. And he couldn't bear to wake up the Prophet ﷺ, even though he was bit. So he endured the pain. And when Rasulullah ﷺ awoke, he discovered Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was in pain. He asked him what had happened. And Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with his lu'ab, with his saliva, he applied it to the wounded area, and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was healed instantly. So this is mentioned from the miracles of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this happened also during that time. Now, what else do we learn from this incident of hijrah? And this is why Umar radiallahu anhu said to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu that if you give me one night's reward, I will give you all of my actions. Because Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu did not just take the prize himself, his family took the prize. Everybody was involved. And we're going to see this. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's family. And this is why Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's family has specific rulings. What specific ruling, you might ask? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu donated all of his wealth in the path of Allah. Is it permissible today to donate your wealth in the path of Allah? It's not. All of it. If somebody says, I want to give everything of mine in the path of Allah, it's not halal for you to do that. One companion, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu, said, Oh Rasulullah, he was sick and he thought he was going to die. Rasulullah came to visit him and he said, Oh Rasulullah, I want to donate all of my wealth in charity. Rasulullah said, no. He said, I want to donate half of my wealth in charity. Rasulullah said, no. He said, I want to donate 1/3 of my wealth in charity. Rasulullah said, 1/3 is okay, but even that is a lot. Why? Rasulullah said, it's better for you to leave your family behind with wealth so they don't have to beg, so they are self-sufficient. Because self-respect and dignity is very important as well. The giving hand is better than the receiving hand. Nabi said in the hadith, the hand on top is better than the hand underneath. And also, who is your first responsibility in your life? You. You have to feed yourself. Yes, you are your first responsibility. Then, of course, your spouse, your children, your parents, if they are deserving and they don't have any means. Your siblings, if they are deserving and they don't have any means and they have rights over you as well. Sisters especially. Sisters are, which is a very important point, by the way. Because in today's day and age, we've completely neglected our sisters. If sisters get divorced and they don't have a lot of means or provisions, people neglect them. And unfortunately, in our cultures today, in the Western cultures, this is the situation most of the times. Let's just say that she didn't get much from her divorce settlement. Example, whatever the settlement was, there wasn't much. And now she's raising kids and she doesn't get support from her ex-husband. Example. Then whose responsibility is it to help her? Father, brothers, older sons. And this is very important. So we have to remember this responsibility, right? So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was different. I don't want to go off on a tangent because I have a habit of doing that. I want to come back to the story. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he was different. He donated all of his wealth in the path of Allah. He did it in Tabuk, and is mentioned even in this incident, he donated up to he took with him 5,000 to 6,000 dirham on the journey. And that's why I'm going to mention this again. I've mentioned it in the past, and it always just, for me, it makes my, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said to me, nobody's wealth helped me more than the wealth of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said in the hadith, there's a hadith of Imam Ahmad in his Musnad, nobody's wealth helped me more than the wealth of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. And Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said, O Rasulullah, if my life and my wealth is not for you, then who is it for? That devotion and dedication, Abu Bakr. But it wasn't just him, it was his household. So why is it Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's situation is specific? I mentioned that his ruling is different from everybody else because of the iman of his household. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's iman was extreme. Nobody's faith was as strong as the faith of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, number one. But the household of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, they were also extremely strong in their faith. And there was no possibility of them wavering from that, even if they were in poverty. And that's why the ruling for him was different. Because had the ruling not been different, Rasulullah would have corrected him. Because that's his role. Rasulullah would correct you if you are making a mistake. And the fact that Rasulullah did not correct Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu means that it was okay for him to have donated all of his wealth. That's because Rasulullah was deeply intimate with the family of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He knew the circumstances of his family very well because he was married to the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So he knew that this is a very different household. So what was the next honor? Who else is part of this journey? The son of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, whose name was Abdullah ibn Abi Bakr. And he had a few sons. There was Abdurrahman as well. But Abdullah ibn Abi Bakr was a very intelligent son, quick-witted, quick-thinking, and he would spend the day in Mecca, and he would come at night, and he would bring news to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu about what's happening in Mecca. What's the talk of the town? What's the next step of the Quraysh? What are they plotting and planning now? What is their strategy? So he was bringing the news to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then in the morning he would go back, return to Mecca, as if nothing had happened, nobody knew about his whereabouts. And he continued to do this for the 3 nights. Then there was another individual whose name was Amir bin Fuhayra. Amir bin Fuhayra was a servant of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu that he had freed, a slave that he had freed. And Amir bin Fuhayra, he would bring a goat, he would graze, he was a shepherd, so that was his excuse to get away from the town, and he would graze his sheep and he would take the herd closer to Cave Thawr. He would bring one of them up the cave. They would milk the goat, they would drink the goat's milk, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would, he would spend the night there as well. In the morning he would take his sheep back and he would follow the same footsteps of Abdullah to wipe out his footsteps so it's not known, or the steps of his horse so it's not known that he was traveling or he was coming there. So he also did this all 3 nights. And then the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Asma, the older sister of Aisha, Asma bint Abi Bakr, she was taking food for them. She was taking food for them. And I want to share a few remarkable points about Asma radiallahu anha, because she was a striking person. She was a soldier, warrior type person, strong personality, huge presence, and patient, and very intelligent, God-fearing. So Asma radiallahu anha, think about it. She was the daughter of the great Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. She was the wife of, her husband was who? Zubayr radiallahu anhu, Zubayr bin Awam. who was one of the 10 companions Rasulullah ﷺ gave glad tidings of Jannah, a very noble companion, Zubair bin Awam. And she was also the mother of one of the great companions, Abdullah bin Zubair. Right, so her son was Abdullah bin Zubair radiallahu anhu. And I'm going to share a story about that in a minute or two, inshallah. So Asma radiallahu anha was the first woman to give birth from the Muhajirin when they migrated to Medina. Because around this incident, she became pregnant. She became pregnant around this incident. And then when they migrated and they arrived in Medina, she gave birth. Basically, she became pregnant a couple of months before this. And when it was time to go and migrate, and she finally migrated with her family, she gave birth to Abdullah bin Zubair radiallahu anhu. So this is a quiz question. If anybody ever asks you, who was the first child to be born to the Muhajirin when they migrated, the migrants, when they migrated from Mecca to Medina? The first child to be born was Abdullah bin Zubair radiallahu anhu. So I want to share a few incidences of her. She was very quick-witted and very devoted to the truth. She was one of the first people to become Muslim. She was around the first 17, 18 people to become Muslim. So one of the earlier Muslims, Asma radiallahu anha. And she was given the title Dhatun Nitaqain or Nitaqatain. Nitaq is a waistband. Waistband, like a band that is worn around with the waist to keep your clothes secure. And what had happened was, during this incident, she wanted to tie the food up for Rasulullah ﷺ and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu to take on their journey, but she didn't have anything to tie with. So her father, Abu Bakr, said to her, why don't you use your waistband and tear it into two pieces? Put one back on your body and use the other one to tie the food. So she did this, and from then on, her name was known as the woman with two waistbands. Right? So that was just her title because of this incident. So she was one of the only people that knew of the plan of Rasulullah ﷺ and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu to escape. She was one of the only ones that was privy. Other people were not privy to this plan. She was from the household of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Now, when they had migrated, it's mentioned that the father of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, whose name was Abu Quhafa, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's father, so her grandfather, he had not embraced Islam. And he came to visit because he had heard that his son has escaped. And his son has left his family behind. And he wanted to inquire what's going on. Now, Asma radiallahu anha was not just an intelligent woman, she also had a lot of dignity and a lot of self-respect. She understood that my grandfather, he's not a Muslim, he's coming to the house because he wants to see what condition we're in, and he's going to try to help us and assist us. There's no harm in receiving help from a non-Muslim, by the way. There's no harm in that. But she didn't feel comfortable. She had a lot of dignity. She didn't want help from anybody. A lot of self-respect. Her grandfather was blind. He enters the house and he asks what the condition is. Your father has left. He hasn't left any money behind. So she responds, she says, yes, he has left money behind. And what she did was she had a few pieces of metal that she put in a bowl, and she asked him she took his hand and she put it in the bowl, and he felt the few pieces of copper, metal, whatever it was. He said, okay, you guys are okay, then fine. And then he leaves the house. And this just shows how sharp she was, how quick thinking she was, or quick-witted she was. Very quickly she thought of this plan so that he would leave the house. And on one occasion, her mother was not a Muslim. The wife of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who was the mother of Asma radiallahu anha, she had not become Muslim. So this is, of course, before Islam. They had Asma radiallahu anha was born before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam became a prophet. Right? So this is Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu's wife from before prophethood. Before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's prophethood. Her name was Qutayla. And she came to visit Asma one time in Medina. When she came to visit Asma in Medina, Asma radiallahu anha wasn't happy about it. Didn't want to admit her. You have to remember, of course, there was hostility in Mecca. And that hostility, some of it continued into Medina. So when her mother is coming to visit her, she's not comfortable with her mother entering her home. So she then inquired with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam whether this was right or wrong. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it's wrong. He said, let her in. She's not hostile to you. Allah then revealed the verses in Surah Al-Mumtahina. Allah does not prevent you from being kind and just to those who do not fight you, who are not combatant with you, those who have not driven you out of your homes. So basically, Qutayla was an innocent woman. She didn't become a Muslim, but she wasn't hostile. She wasn't combative. She wasn't fighting against Muslims. So there's no harm in you being hospitable towards your mother. And of course, this is a very important lesson for those who have non-Muslim family members, but also for those who don't, but have community members. Because people, what is our interaction with non-Muslims like? That's a very important question, right? As Muslims living in a non-Muslim land or non-Muslim majority land, we have to be kind, we have to be generous, we have to be respectful, and we have to display good manners to everybody, Muslim or non-Muslim, because Allah is telling us very clearly, people are not fighting you, they're not driving you out of their homes, or your home, sorry, driving you out of your homes. Allah does not prevent you from being kind and just to them. Only those who are fighting you and are hostile to you, then the circumstances are different, because you have to defend yourself. You have to protect your assets, your dignity, your property, your land, your family. Right? That's a different matter. But otherwise, in general circumstances, there's no justification for any person to exaggerate or be unjust towards another person based on their religion. And this is a very important point. So Rasul ﷺ taught Asma radiallahu anha a very vital lesson, which of course is a lesson for the entire ummah. Now I want to share one more story about Asma radiallahu anha, because I think, actually I'm going to leave that story. But in a nutshell, it was regarding her son, Abdullah ibn Zubair. Later on, we're talking about 60 years after Rasulullah ﷺ passes away. She lived for a very long time, Asma. She passed away when she was around 100. And it's mentioned that Asma, radiallahu anha, her son Abdullah bin Zubair, the one that we were speaking about earlier, very important companion of Rasulullah ﷺ. He was the first child to be born in Medina to the Muhajirin. He was martyred and killed by Abdul Malik bin Marwan's people, specifically Hajjaj bin Yusuf. So this was during the Umayyad Caliphate. And Marwan had passed away, who was the Khalifa, and people wanted Abdullah bin Zubair to be the Khalifa. And Abdullah bin Zubair was a fair person, he was a just person, he was a pious person, he was righteous, he was a companion of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he had support from a few countries, from a few regions. The people of those regions, they pledged their allegiance to him, and they also committed to help him. But Abdul Malik bin Marwan wanted to seize power, and he had set Hajjaj bin Yusuf as the governor to carry out his work for him. And there were some vicious wars or fighting that took place. And finally, the people of Abdullah bin Zubair radiallahu anhu couldn't take it any longer. And they also deserted him. And even his family deserted him. So he comes to Mecca, and he comes to his mother, and he says to his mother, he says to his mother, Mother, I need some advice from you. She says, how can I advise you while people are pelting, the people of Marwan and Hajjaj is pelting your people, and you are here? He says, no, mother, I need your advice. So he asks his mother what he should do. And his mother says that if you believe that you are on the truth and you are sincere, then you can't hide. You have to go out and you have to challenge Hajjaj. This is what you can do. And this was a very emotional incident, because she knows that her son is going to be martyred soon. Because there was no way that Abdullah bin Zubair could take on Hajjaj and his army. And she drew him close for one last time, said, let me smell you before you pass away. and then she let him go like this. So she was a very brave woman who stood up for the truth, and she wasn't afraid, even if her son had to pass and he had to die. And he was extremely proud and said, Allah has blessed me with a mother like you. Allah has blessed me with a mother like you, and I'm sincere in the fact that I'm doing this only for the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is something that happened with Asma radiallahu anha. Later on, she lost her son, Abdullah bin Zubair, to these circumstances. Now what happens is, when the Quraysh, who a few of the members of the Quraysh who were waiting outside the house of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had left and thrown dust, covered their eyes, and read some verses of Surah Yasin, they were still waiting there. And the man was walking past, and he asked them, "What are you guys doing here?" And they said that we're waiting for Muhammad. He said, "Woe to you! He's already left." And when he left, he was throwing dust. So they started to rub their heads, and they felt some dust. But then they looked through the crack, and they still saw somebody sleeping. So they've waited. Has this man told us the truth? Is he trying to deceive us? Let's wait. Let's wait. Now, Allama Suhaili mentions that even though they had the capacity to break the door down, the ability to break the door down and enter, they heard a scream of a woman from another place, and they assumed it was from inside. And they didn't want to break down the door, lest the Arabs accuse them of breaking down a house that had a woman in it. It would have been very undignified for them to do that, even though the scream came from somewhere else. So this is something that had stopped them. Then they entered the house in the morning, and they discovered that it was Ali radiallahu anhu sleeping there, and it was not Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. They inquired, "Where is Rasulullah? Where is Muhammad?" And Ali radiallahu anhu said, "I don't know." Then they went to the house of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu, and they entered, and Asma radiallahu anha herself mentions that that Abu Jahl bin Hisham, he came in and he inquired about the whereabouts of my father and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I informed them that I don't know, and he slapped me. He slapped me so hard that my earring broke. That's how bad the slap was. And at this point, Allama Tantawi mentioned something very beautiful. He says, cowards only hit women. He was a coward. If he was a man, he would not have done that. So he's a coward. This is the truth. So we're going to end here, brothers and sisters, inshallah. We're going to learn more about the other incidences that happen. Oh, let's just move on one more bit. What happens is the Quraysh send out a search warrant. Now we've come to that point of the incident. They discover that Rasul ﷺ and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu have escaped. They looked everywhere, but to no avail, no luck. They couldn't find them. So they send out a search warrant. Whoever brings Muhammad and Abu Bakr, dead or alive, will receive 100 camels. 100 camels. 100 camels is a lot of wealth. One camel in today's market is minimum $5,000. Probably around that much. So you're looking at $500,000. $500,000 in that time was a lot of wealth. A lot of wealth. So you can imagine everybody's thirsty. Everybody wants that wealth. Groups of people are going out searching. But to no avail. Until a few people arrived where? At the cave. And they climbed up to the peak of the cave. And they thought, nobody could be here now. We've come to the peak. They looked beneath them, and this was the moment that Allah is referring to in the Quran when He says, when His companion said to him, "Don't be afraid, Allah is with us." Because at this moment, what happens is, a group of men are at the peak of the cave. All they have to do is look down and be a bit more meticulous in their search, and they would find Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, this is one of those sensitive moments in life where it's hanging in the balance. If you get caught, everything's over. But this is the defining moment. If you're not caught, then the world is your oyster after that. This is one of those moments. Think about it. It's one of those moments, right? Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is this close to being caught, like this close. And the beautiful miracle that Allah allows at this moment is what? Spider web. A spider spins a web at the mouth of the cave. And the mushrikeen, the disbelievers, are looking at the entrance of the cave and saying, nobody came here. If anybody came here, this web would not be in this state. It's not possible. So they depart from there and they leave. Now when things died down and cooled down a little, at the 3-day mark, this is when Abdullah bin Urayqit al-Laythi, the navigator that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu had hired, he arrives now with 2 horses, 2 camels for them to travel. So this is when the traveling starts now. And then we're going to see one incident we're going to learn next week is we're going to learn all the incidences that happened during the journey. Right? So there was the incident of Suraqa, there's the incident of Ma'bad, and there's the incident of another young boy who was grazing sheep, and he witnessed something from Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and he took his shahada at that time, and he became a Muslim. So we're going to learn that incident. And maybe we'll come to the Quba, inshallah. Like we'll come to the point where Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam enters Quba. We pray that Allah Azza wa Jal grants us the ability to reflect and ponder and take lessons from this, inshallah. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma bihamdik. ونشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.